Good afternoon and welcome to all of you here in Clayton Hall and on the campus of the University of Delaware. And why am I saying that? We're celebrating today the launch of the Center for Science, Ethics, and Public Policy. We've heard some terrific speeches this morning, and I know that this next one will be just as exciting as the previous. As Tom said, I'm Dr. Marcia Dixon, Chair of the Department of Fashion and Apparel Studies, and I'm really pleased to introduce our next guest. But before I make that introduction, I'd also like to welcome those who are attending the event by way of FIBERcast. FIBERcast is a podcast series produced by the University of Delaware's Department of Fashion and Apparel Studies. FIBERcast topics tackle current issues of interest to apparel industry professionals, academics, and students. The FIBERcast series has had thousands of listeners since it was introduced just a few years ago. And this is the first time we are broadcasting video as well as audio during the FIBERcast. So as well as being part of today's inauguration of the Center for Science, Ethics, and Public Policy, the next lecture is also part of the Fashioning Social Responsibility Distinguished Lecture Series. And this series exposes campus and community audiences to a range of issues and perspectives associated with social responsibility and sustainability in the apparel industry. The lecture is made possible through funding provided by the Provost Office at the University of Delaware, UD's College of Arts and Sciences, the Center for Science, Ethics, and Public Policy, and the Department of Fashion and Apparel Studies. And before we start, I would like to remind the FIBERcast listeners that anytime during the program you may email us your questions at the webpage you used to tune in to today's FIBERcast program, and we'll hope to be able to integrate those into the question and answer period that starts later. Is the product you're buying made in a way that is fair, healthy, and safe? I suspect many of us have had this question lingering in the backs of our minds since we heard the news about Apple and the working conditions in its Foxconn factories in China. With brands and companies outsourcing production of consumer products to extended global supply chains, how does a company ensure those are fair, healthy, and safe conditions in the suppliers' factories? While buyers can go it alone and have for many years, there are an increasing number of opportunities to join forces with other buyers, with suppliers, with multi-stakeholder organizations, and with civil society organizations to make inroads on these tough issues. And our guest today will discuss how sustainable compliance can be leveraged with a multitude of collaborative activities. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Greg Nebel is the Adidas Group's head of social and environmental affairs for the Americas and a founding member of the Social and Environmental Affairs Department in 1997. He directs regional field operations and compliance activities with the group's footwear, apparel, and accessories supply chains. He is the Social and Environmental Affairs corporate point person for the Adidas Group's Americas-based brands, which include Adidas North America, Reebok International, TaylorMade, Adidas Golf, Rockport, CCM, and Ashworth, and also Adidas Group's subsidiaries and licensees. His global management responsibilities include strategic compliance planning, methodology development, compliance performance measurement, stakeholder verification processes, and public reporting. Greg has served as a director of the Fair Labor Association's board since 2003 and the executive board since January 2011. And this is where I've gotten to know Greg well, and I can testify really to his deep commitment to ethics and workers' rights, and I greatly respect him as a colleague and a friend. And I was talking with Greg about a week or 10 days ago, and he shared with me that he had flown 94,000 miles so far this year. And I assumed a lot of it was back and forth to Central America, where a lot of his responsibilities lie. But he said, no, this is just across country between the two offices he has, the Adidas office in Portland and the Reebok office in Boston. So you can imagine the kind of dedication right there, the physical dedication it takes to do this job. Greg also sits on the board of the Fair Factories Clearinghouse, an organization dedicated to the enhancement of ethical sourcing practices, and he participates in our advisory board for the Fashion and Apparel Studies Department here at UD. Greg has been with Adidas since 1993 and served 5 years as the head of apparel sourcing for the Americas. He has spent 30 years working for fashion and athletic brands in their apparel and footwear supply chains in the Americas, Europe, and Asia. Greg has a BA in political science from Providence College and completed a European Studies program at Freiburg University in Switzerland. He speaks French, Spanish, and Portuguese and makes his home in Paulsbo, Washington. And please help me welcome Greg Nebel.
And is this the machine that I use to make the slides go? Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, that commuting, it has not taken a terrible toll this year. And if it was last year, that would have been spent going back and forth to Central America. But this year, and that's one of the interesting parts of my job, I've been spending more time looking at the embedment and implementation of compliance policy and practices within the Adidas Group's brands and entities. And let me just kind of put a little bit into context. Marcia explained that we have 6 brands in our portfolio: Adidas, Reebok, TaylorMade, CCM, which is the hockey company, Rockport, and Ashworth. We're a $15 billion US company, and our supply chain is well north of 1,200 factories, and that's primarily Tier 1, and not including the Tier 2 and even Tier 3 upstream factories. There are 46,000 employees in the Adidas Group. We do business in 100 countries throughout the world, and we produce products in 74 countries throughout the world. And when I was thinking earlier this morning about the presentation I was going to make, and when I was listening to some of the speakers earlier today, I was thinking about rating and how do consumers view us, or how do consumers really think about whether the products that they are buying are made in fair, healthy, and safe working conditions. And the context of this monolithic supply chain and number of workers, and there are 600,000 workers that are engaged in various countries in those factories making our products. How do we ensure that they are being treated properly, fairly, and that their environments are healthy and safe? And how do we rate that? And you know, one of the presenters earlier this morning talked a lot about, you know, the outside of looking at corporate responsibility, but from the outside at this brand. And what I'd like to try and do today in this presentation, and please, questions, you don't hesitate to interrupt me at any point, and we will have plenty of time for questions later, but how do we really look at corporate responsibility and portray that to you who are our consumers also? How do you have to answer questions, or can you answer questions? How many slaves made your Adi Zero product and that technology? What would my app on my smartphone tell me about Adidas or Reebok and the product I'm going to buy right now? What about, can I find out today? I need to know today what's going on, not tomorrow and not the day after. How do we know ourselves? How do we measure what we're doing and the products that we're making and the facilities that we're making these products in? And how do we show you, our consumers, what we are doing for our environmental and social performance? So, what is a company's role when the suppliers who make your products are on the other side of the world? Or, believe it or not, they could be in the next town over. People, you know, think about an athletic company and, you know, our products are being made in China Well, 25% of our supply chain is in China, but we actually produce in 74 countries throughout the world. We do produce products in the United States. We do produce products in Canada, as well as Bulgaria and Turkey. It's not just Southeast Asia. Central America and South America are primary sourcing countries for us also. So in the next 5 years in our company and our growth pattern, we've looked at how do we, achieve qualitative and sustainable growth in all of our brands. It's not just Adidas, but it's Reebok and the other brands. And how do we influence the perception of customers and the people buying our products? Consumers expect us to do more than just consider the social and environmental issues. They want the products to be the best that they can buy, and not just from a performance aspect, an athletic performance aspect, but also buying these products from the companies that are at the leading edge in terms of making a difference to the world at large. We have to be committed to looking at our business operations and how to manage those in a sustainable way. So we're striving to be the global leader in the sporting goods industry. This demands that we return strong financial results, for sure. But leadership isn't just about that. It's also about how success is achieved and striking the balance between business needs and social and environmental demands. Balancing these interests requires our commitment, a strategic direction, efficient and careful execution, as well as reflecting on what we are doing and how that will impact us as we move forward. We operate globally. We outsource a majority of our production in a multi-tiered supply chain. That multi-tiered supply chain, as I mentioned before, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. There are raw materials that go back to cotton fields, that go back to petroleum refineries. How far do we go back? When we're looking at corporate responsibility and a sustainable strategy for corporate responsibility, we look at 5 particular areas. There's environmental management and embedding environmental sustainability in all of our products, processes, and services to improve our impact across our value chain and to positively contribute to our business performance. Environmental management is not just in the product, it's in the people making the product, it's in the raw materials that we use to make those products, it's in how we run our facilities. And I'll come to that a little bit later. So it's people, product, production. When you look at those 3 areas, it's not just in the supply chain. Social compliance, managing business risk and social compliance in our supply chain, which is pretty dynamic. It's constantly changing, it's growing, it's very complex. There are multiple relationships, stretched lines of communications, and control. So how do we approach that? Extending our engagements internally and externally. So engagements and collaboration. And it's partnering with others to embed new thinking and better ways of collaboration within our business and along our supply chain, working together to make a difference. I'm going to spend most of the rest of this presentation really focusing in on engagement and collaboration because, as Marcia mentioned earlier on, that's one thing that we cannot do on our own. No company can do that on their own. And by the engagements and collaborations, it's working with the people in our sourcing department as well as the local societies and communities where we're making our products. Community affairs, making a difference in the communities where we operate and supporting programs that truly meet local needs. If we're working with factories in a community, we are part of that community. We're not just bringing employment, but we're also citizens in that community. So what do we do to help support that community? And then reporting and transparency. we as a department manage the reporting and communication about what we're doing for sustainability. And going back to this morning's first presentation, what do you report? What do people really want to know about what you're doing? We just published an annual report, our 12th annual report for sustainability, and it's 70 pages long, but it could have been 700 pages long. So what messaging, what do people want to know? What do you tell them, and how do you tell them? Is it online? Is it in a printed form? So what we're looking at doing is reporting and making sure that people do get the messaging, but how do you find that messaging? And then at the bottom of all of this, although it's at the center rather than the bottom, corporate responsibility, there's innovation. And we as a group, as a company, and as a department are looking at innovative ways of looking with and treating with environmental management, social compliance, community affairs, engagement, and our reporting. There has to be a measure of innovation in that. The work that we do, what do these activities end up influencing? Social compliance, environmental management, reporting and transparency, engagement and collaboration. What do they all mean? What do they influence? And we look at several different areas, 4 different areas. In many ways, we're looking at managing business and reputational risk in our supply chain. That is everything from improving the performance of our suppliers, measuring that, integrating the UN human rights principles, the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act, integrating these types of expectations and in some cases jurisprudence or legal requirements into our business operations. Looking at a sustainable manufacturing initiative that is training and helping suppliers to manufacture their products and minimize non-compliant practices and negate less than positive environmental impacts. When we're looking at embedding environmental sustainability across the supply chain, the work that we've had to do with that is building a reporting tool on the environment that not only looks at green company activities, which is the Adidas Group people, product, and production, but also looking at what our suppliers are doing. Publishing a roadmap to zero discharge. Looking at ISO 14001 certification in our 5 major headquarters in North America and our global headquarters in Germany. And we've done that in the last 15 months. Transparency and reporting. Reporting, as I mentioned before, what messaging are you trying to deliver? And what is it that you want to have come back from your reporting? Dow Jones Sustainability Index. We have been rated for 12 years as a sectoral leader and a leading company in the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. We report for the London Olympics, the greenest Olympics that have been ever held or are being held, and the requirements for disclosure and supply chain performance are the most onerous of all of the requirements we've ever had to fulfill as a sponsor and a participant in the London Olympics. And then when we look at what I would call more of a regular type of engagement for reporting and disclosure, and that's our participation as a member company of the Fair Labor Association and a company involved in the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, and developing indexes and reporting and accreditation of our program, so that, again, coming back to what is the consumer looking for and what is the consumer thinking that we are doing, and is that the full story, what we're doing. The 4th area, engagement and collaboration, partnering with others to embed new thinking and more efficient ways of working. Sustainable compliance can be leveraged within a multitude of collaboration activities. Buyers can go it alone. We can do sustainability. We can act on sustainability on our own. Many companies still do. Companies have for a long time. But there's an increasing number of opportunities to join forces with other buyers, with suppliers, with multi-stakeholder organizations, with civil society. And why? We can't operate in a vacuum. A manufacturing supply site for us will have a number of buyers in that factory. Collaboration has become something that's very important to a successful achievement of our work, because what happens if we are telling a factory, here's an issue, here's how we can fix it, but are the other buyers saying that same thing? There's an old story about the fire extinguisher and the height of placing the fire extinguisher on the factory floor. And it was many years ago when that really came home to me, because it was another buyer in a factory that I was explaining what our standard was. And they said, well, this other customer said that it should be 6 inches higher. And I looked at that and I said, let's walk up to that extinguisher. And it happened to be in a Central American country. And I'm a guy that's kind of tall, and I'm taller than most people in Central American countries. And when we went up to that factory wall, I said, why don't you walk up there? Can you lift that extinguisher off the wall? And they couldn't, because it was at the Western standard. And trying to get it like this and pull it off the wall, it was too heavy. And so we just figured out what we should be doing for the height and placement of that fire extinguisher. And then I presented that to the other buyers that were in that factory. And sometimes the pragmatic approach, even though there's legal precedence and even though there is a series of guidelines that we should be using, in many ways when we look at practical application and when we look at the people that we're working with and when we're involving them, we ended up placing that fire extinguisher where most people in that factory would be able to walk up and to lift it from a pure ergonomic sense. You have a very heavy fire extinguisher, your arm should be extended more. So the people in that factory, how do we go and grab that and take it down? But collaboration ultimately becomes a way of looking at harmonizing the messaging that we're giving to our supply chain, harmonizing the tools and the practices that we monitor performance in those factories. Collaboration is sharing data for monitoring assessments and promoting management systems that guide proper management of the employment relationship. So one of the things that when we look at labor, health, safety, and environmental compliance, collaboration and engagement is becoming more and more important. We believe in it, we lead it, we ask other companies to join us in that. Why? Leverage to drive prompt and sustainable improvements. It allows greater consistency and harmonization in the global compliance landscape. We can support embedment of compliance management in human resource and HSC, health, safety, and environmental operational management systems. From a factory's perspective, we're reducing the number of on-site factory inspections, the cost of auditing, the pressures and the workloads associated with those monitoring visits. Now, we may not do fewer visits, but there'll be more value-added visits. And we'll be carrying on what our predecessor did when they went into that factory and did their inspection. So we take that forward. We're trying to drive common industry practices and increase efficiencies. I wanted to give a few examples and talk a little bit about some of the collaborative engagements that we and other companies are participating in. The Fair Labor Association, a tripart organization that includes companies, universities in North America, and non-governmental organizations, and all working towards ensuring that there are fair, healthy, and safe working conditions and supply chains that are making products of those member companies. The Fair Labor Association has a code of conduct. They have a set of expectations and responsible buying practices for their member companies. We as member companies are evaluated on how we are acting with our supply chain. So the Fair Labor Association will send in monitors, independent monitors, to report on conditions in those factories, but not so much to publicly report on the conditions in the factories, but to report on the member companies and their activities to ensure fair, healthy, and safe working conditions. So it's not monitoring the factories for the sake of monitoring, it's monitoring the member companies and what are we doing to impact and influence changes in the workplace and how we manage our buying practices. So it's not just as a company complying with law in China as a supplier, but how do we manage our sourcing teams and the practices in which we buy products? How do we place purchase orders? Are we considering as a buyer that asking for a shorter lead time than what a factory is willing to give us, what the consequences of that may be? Excessive working hours. Are we considering what price negotiations, and if we're not intelligently negotiating prices, what that can mean for the payment of a minimum wage or for the payment of benefit entitlements? So it's more of a holistic approach. It's not just looking at what factories are doing, but the Fair Labor Association also looks at what member companies are doing, and then reporting out annually and publicly on what those member companies are doing. Collaboration with other brands. This has been painful. It shouldn't be, but it's really painful. We've managed to look at, and coming back to the fire extinguisher story, every company wants to feel that they have their own proprietary code of conduct, that, you know, their way is the best and that we are the leaders. What we've tried to look at is how can we work with others and minimize some of the smaller differences on whether it's 6 inches higher or lower, but do we share the same values on looking at the freedom of workers to associate and to collectively bargain? Do we look at how fair wages are being paid versus just the minimum wage? So forming these collaborations, that's the real reason why it's been so difficult, is not every company is looking at this the same way. There are still some companies, if you remember that previous slide, that certainly focus more on doing this to manage risk and the reputation to our brand. And look, I'm a businessman who's an advocate, okay, so I understand the importance, and the Adidas Group looks at the importance of maintaining our brand's reputation and making sure that we manage risk to the brand. But at the same time, we also want to be buying responsibly. Coming back to collaboration with other brands, there's another company, probably the only other really big company in the athletic industry that wasn't part of the Adidas Group, that we collaborate with quite a bit. We share over 250 factories with that company. So the opportunity, and we think alike, and we look at buying practices, and we look at the freedom to associate and collectively bargain, and we look at fair wages. We look at a lot of the aspects of fair, healthy, and safe working conditions in a very similar way. And because we share these factories, we're able to work with those factories and to establish common messaging and harmonized activities where we are not coming in and doing a performance audit covering the same things that our counterparts in the other brand did 3 weeks ago, but we have shared information. They have shared information with us on what their last visit showed or what their last training session was, and we're able to take that and then plan in the next step. So we're moving forward instead of constantly starting back here, and everybody is here. So this is the way to move forward. Collaboration with other brands. There are some companies working very hard to make that happen. And I would propose that suppliers are really ready for this to happen, have it happen also. The suppliers that are not ready for it to happen are the ones that have been taking advantage of the opportunity to say, but how can we do that for you when our buyer X, that other customer, said we should be doing it the other way? But there are fewer and fewer suppliers, happily, that are saying that. The Strategic Apparel Coalition is an organization of companies that started recently who are establishing a set of industry indicators that will move towards industry change. They're looking at assessment data that can drive industry efficiencies. And they're looking at verification that can drive consumer choice. This is a newer organization, but it's moving forward. The Sustainable Compliance Initiative, the SCI. This has been an interesting development that started 4 years ago with 7 companies that got together in New York City. None of us told our legal departments because they would have been yelling at us about antitrust implications for all sitting down together. But the goal that these 7 companies had 4 years ago was to talk about how we could harmonize the tools that each of our companies were using to evaluate performance in our supply chains. The Fair Labor Association joined our collaboration and our activities, and we have now launched, under the auspices of the Fair Labor Association, the Sustainable Compliance Initiative, which is an auditing methodology that looks at the treatment of the employment relationship. How does an employer and an employee engage with each other? It's not only the root cause of what is not being done that leads to non-compliance, but it's looking at how do you recruit, how do you hire, how do you promote, how do you train, how do you pay, how do you discipline, and how do you terminate your relationship with your employees. And that is the innovation in the Sustainable Compliance Initiative and this auditing methodology. The goal was that it would be something that every company would be able to use. And we were looking smaller. We were looking at the apparel and footwear and the athletic and casual wear industries. But this tool was first tested in the last several months in the Foxconn investigation for Apple. And there were 35,000 worker interviews done as part of the use of this tool. This tool is the way to move forward. This tool is looking at human resource management. For those of us who are employed here in North America, we know what human resource departments are. We know what contracts are. We know what U.S. employment law is. There's no different a scenario when you're in a factory. And whether that's in China or El Salvador, human resource practices and a management system to enforce the consistent application of human resource management, it's critical, no matter the industry, no matter the country. And what the Sustainable Compliance Initiative, what the SCI monitoring methodology and tool does, is measure the application of the human resource management system within those manufacturing environments. The GSCP, the Global Social Compliance Program, this organization several years ago started. It's an organization of companies from Europe, North America, South America. And what has been developed by the GSCP is an equivalence process that basically lets companies and initiatives benchmark their own systems our own systems for compliance, the tools and processes against the agreed best existing practices as part of the preference tools of the GSCP. So the GSCP acts as kind of a sounding board and a set of best practices that we can evaluate, or any company can evaluate what you're doing against what best practices are out there. The Fair Factory Clearinghouse. This is an extraordinary organization that allows for the sharing of compliance data by member companies. You would think, and again I'll come back to antitrust and talk about that a little bit, because it is the punishment and price components that any company that competes has to be concerned about. We cannot talk about price with our competitors, the price of products. We cannot talk about sanctions or punishments that we would be issuing or warning or enforcing with factories that don't meet our expectations for compliance or the laws. What has happened with the Fair Factory Clearinghouse is it's received a business review letter from the Department of Justice that says your activities are not crossing over the line into antitrust. And what that does is it allows us within this environment to share data about compliance activities, and to do it in a way that we don't breach any antitrust implications. But more importantly, it allows us to move forward with harmonizing tools, but also strategically planning out with another buyer who's in a factory sharing with us. This is a place where we can see what their last audit said, what their last remedial activity was, and we can plan from that step forward. Or we can go back and verify what was called out in that last buyer's remediation plan. And we can share it back with that buyer. We've even brought factories into the fold where they can be communicating with us on this shared compliance platform. So this allows us to really share an immense amount of data. And just as a point of reference, in the year 2011, we shared via the Fair Factory Clearinghouse compliance data on 913 factories in our supply chains with other companies. So when you look at the critical mass and the momentum that can be for other companies to use that data and try to be smarter in how they're assessing and working with those factories, and in what they can offer us to help move the needle faster and stronger and more sustainably in communicating and acting and engaging with our supply chains, there's a lot of opportunity here. Oh, Better Work. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention Better Work. Better Work is a program of the International Labor Organization. It was built with suppliers, with manufacturers as the main audience. And basically, what this does is it's a program that allows suppliers to self-assess under the auspices of the ILO and within the auspices of the Better Work program, to access training and capacity building that will close gaps in the issues found in the Better Work audits. Better Work does have independent monitors that are accredited by their organization, but the real message around Better Work is that it's a supplier empowerment program. It's encouraging suppliers to take on the responsibility for fair, healthy, and safe working conditions and empowering them to act on that, versus this historic paradigm of companies coming in and monitoring our supply chains. Better Work is an opportunity for factories to be monitoring themselves, to do it with a third party, and then to report out on that. So they're showing what they can do. I guess when it comes back at the end of all of this is collaboration and engagements need to include a series of events. And whether it's, a harmonized tool like the SCI, whether it's partnering with other brands and buyers and factories and sharing that data on a shared compliance database, and whether the empowerment of factories combining with that is pushing factories to take on more of their responsibilities. What I tried to illustrate very quickly was all of these efforts can't take place on their own. They have to be combined together. They all have a role to play, and they can all result in some sort of measurement, some sort of opportunity for verification, some sort of opportunity for transparency and reporting. But in all aspects, we recognize that our stakeholders have a legitimate interest in our social and environmental performance, and our ambition is to try and fulfill that and to do it in a way that's complete and as accurate as possible. I put up here a URL for our 2011 Social and Environmental Affairs Annual Report. This is our 12th annual report. We were the first company in the sporting goods and athletic industry to report back in the year 2000. It's online. It was released last Thursday for 2011, and I welcome you to look at and read that report. And going back to what we heard in our first session this morning, there's layers of complexity, there's layers of detail in the work that we try to do. And it's not easy to talk about it in 35 minutes or to show it in 7 slides or to really say, without knowing for sure, what is it that you really want to know about whether your products were made in fair, healthy, and safe working conditions? What is it that I can tell you that will convince you to buy that product, or that you're comfortable supporting our brands in what we're doing? And I would just offer in closing, our annual report or any of the previous 11 as kind of a glimpse behind the curtain, and it's a very transparent curtain. But take a look at what we've been trying to do. And we do talk about the ugliness as well as the things that we have been successful at doing. I mentioned earlier this morning in a question to one of our presenters who was talking about an index and labeling and looking at what a factory, what a company can say about their products. And my question was, it's not always about the quantification. It's not always in the numbers. What about the subjective aspect of commitment? And how do you understand whether a company is committed? Now, I know that numbers are objective, formulas are objective, but in social justice, in labor rights, there aren't always those metrics that are so clear. And I would propose that a lot of what happens to really move a company forward and to make a company attractive is how they can talk about the commitment to continuing to deal with those issues. No matter how complex, no matter what the lack of quantification is, how do you keep moving forward on that? And that's a problem with indexes that, as much as I've been working with them, and I mentioned earlier today for 15 years, because we have key performance indicator ratings for our factories. We have key performance indicators on compliance for our business entities. For the 65 parts of the Adidas Group, brands, subsidiaries, licensees, distributors, there are 65 entities in the Adidas Group that can buy, produce, and sell products under our brands and under the group. How do we measure them? And in no case have we been able to find that we can just make it quantitative. We've had to build in a subjective thing which is called commitment. And that's hard to measure. But transparency hopefully goes a bit of a way towards illustrating that. And I'll stop now and be happy to take any questions, challenges. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry.
hope it's going to come on. We're going to circulate a microphone for questions so the FIBERcast listeners can also get on. And Pat, I guess there's a question over here.
Gentleman in the dark shirt back there. Would you raise your hand, sir?
Can you tell me how many of your factories have unions and how many union members do you have on your Fair Labor Association?
I'll start with the latter first. You mean participating members of the Fair Labor Association? How many are unions, trade unions?
Union members, basically. Do you have any representation from your factories sitting on this board?
No, the Fair Labor Association is composed of non-governmental organizations, U.S. universities, and companies. There is no trade union that is represented on the Fair Labor Association board or is a member of the Fair Labor Association. However, some of the individuals that are part of the organizations that are affiliated with the Fair Labor Association, I am sure that there are trade union members of those individuals, but there is not a trade union that is part of the Fair Labor Association. In our supply, sorry, I wanted to.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Your supply chain, which was the first question that you were asking, I believe, how many of our suppliers have trade unions, correct? Less than 10% that we are aware of. However, that number can be adjusted upwards if we want to look at in China and in Vietnam, where by law, the All China Federation of Trade Unions has a leader and a representative group in every employer in China. We choose to believe that that is not a valid representation of trade unions or freedom of association. But discounting those, a little bit less than 10% of our supply chain is unionized.
Thank you. So yes, a very good question. I was one of those students. I was part of the USAS back in college, and one of the things.
I knew I remembered you from somewhere.
Yeah, there we go. Sleeping out on the lawn, right? So for the rest of my life, I will never buy another pair of Nike shoes, and that decision has a lot to do with my concern about the actual conditions that people are facing in the factories. And so what I care about isn't whether or not Nike's committed to doing something about it or they're making progress from a very low baseline, but exactly how much they achieve. I mean, if they radically change their practices, I would reevaluate that commitment. So one of the things the USAS wants is universities to sign on to the Workers' Rights Consortium, which actually does factory monitoring of the conditions people are facing. And I wondered why you guys hadn't joined, or were you a member? I don't know if companies can even be members of the Workers' Rights Consortium, but you seem to be more concerned about what you guys are doing rather than what your factories are doing and the conditions your people are facing, whether they could afford to buy toothpaste or they were brushing their teeth with the ashes from the fire. So.
Sure. And I know you were talking about not buying Nike products, and I would encourage you to reconsider, even though they're our competition. What Nike's done in their work and in their program is leadership also. And there are brands out there that are working hard at this. So please do reconsider it. And I believe they are reporting annually also. So they have a URL also for their annual report. I'm sitting here talking about what we do with our suppliers because that is part of transparency. My day job is actually being in the factories, making sure those things are happening. My day job is meeting with our subsidiary executive management, with our buying people, and making sure that they're embedding and practicing responsible buying activities when they're buying products in the factories that are out there. I'm engaging with governments to look at and to have them consider the active and proper regulation of their laws. I was mentioning at lunch earlier today, there isn't a gap in countries' laws even in China's laws. China has great laws. What is missing when we find these countries with violations is a lack of effective regulation and enforcement of those laws. So looking at things like minimum wage, I'm not going to go out and try, yes, let me reword that. I want to make sure that every factory that we are working with is paying at least the minimum wage. But what we're working on now as a team and as the Adidas group is whether factories are paying fair wages. And it's not just we have to pay a living wage. A living wage isn't sustainable in and of itself. Do you have the legal jurisprudence to back up your wages? Do you have wage balancing mechanisms? Do you have wage setting mechanisms? What do you do in the holistic picture, 12 dimensions of wages, to make them fair, of which minimum wage is one, as is living wage? So we're looking at a broader picture of employment practices and looking at the business applications and the impacts of local civil society, too. Minimum wage setting isn't something we do as a buyer or as a company. That's generated by a government and by civil society in that country. So can we identify that? Can we carve that out as part of the reason why there's an issue with this wage, or why we haven't gotten to a living wage or a fair wage? So we're trying to deal with the complexities of all of these issues. But I'm sitting here talking to you about it today because that's part of our transparency, and hopefully that'll help people understand some of the complexities and dynamics that go into this.
This is the time of the year that many of us are getting proxy statements from companies. You spent a little bit of time talking about what people really want to know. Some of the things that I've seen on ones that I get have to do with political contributions, who's getting them, environmental fines and violations and that kind of thing. Are there any of those kinds of things on your company's proxy requests for votes? And if so, what are they?
Yeah, and the first thing I would have to explain is that we're a German multinational. So we are required under a set of corporate governance that is based on German law. I don't know the specific questions and the points that would be required for us to report under German law, but we do it. Our shareholders meeting is in Fürth, Germany, I believe on May 8th. So certainly we are prepared for those questions and answering challenges around how we've performed and whether we're fulfilling corporate governance. But it's a quite different landscape of governance in Europe, and in particular under German corporate governance, than in the U.S.
We do have a question from one of the FIBERcast listeners. How is Adidas working on sustainability with their factories in emerging economies? And I think they're probably meaning the environmental piece. So how are you working with your factories?
Yeah. In the last 2 years, what we've tried to do with an environmental approach with our factories is to, first of all, set a strategy with them to identify through a self-assessment by our Tier 2 raw material suppliers and our footwear Tier 1 suppliers what is the baseline of what you're doing or not doing, and then developing a 3-year strategic plan that takes the shortfalls in waste management, in energy, in reducing energy consumption, in using more sustainable raw materials. Whatever the shortfalls have been that were illustrated in that assessment is placed in a 3-year strategic compliance plan, and companies, our suppliers, are now annually reporting on that back to us. In this annual report, you will see some of the first outcomes of what is happening with our suppliers and how they are addressing environmental issues in the supply chain. But basically, it's been identifying the highest risk companies, if you will, raw material suppliers, and certainly suppliers where there are more chemicals or other toxic opportunities in the manufacturing process, and to identify that group, to measure what they're doing, to measure the shortfall, and then to build a strategic plan and have them annually report on that.
Thank you very much, Greg, for your very interesting talk. I'm wondering how encompassing or holistic CSR is within a leading company such as Adidas. For example, does CSR include what your colleagues do on taxation, in lobbying? Just a few days ago, I was just on the net and I saw that Apple, through legal instruments, is engaged in minimizing its tax liabilities in quite an aggressive way. And I believe that this is common practice among large companies. And I'm wondering, as a champion of CSR and of responsible business, what's the situation like at Adidas? And do you see this potentially as a problem, given that obviously companies themselves depend on the collective goods that are also provided through governments, through public expenditures, and in the long run, if companies like GE and other leading corporates are providing little or nothing to the public purse, we'll probably be heading for some trouble.
Yeah, and our department doesn't work with that aspect of it, but I would also say we're quite different besides the volume differential from Apple. But we have 100 subsidiaries throughout the world. So, you know, as I've understood some of the issues with what Apple is trying to do, it's operating as a U.S. company that's looking to repatriate profits. And I mean, I don't want to get myself into trouble or anybody else into trouble by commenting too much on it, but we have a different structure. Adidas China is a Chinese company, and they operate as a Chinese organization. There's a reporting line that comes back up to Adidas in Germany, but that's on a marketing perspective. That's on a brand perspective. So the financial purview and how we operate under taxation and regulatory authorities for finance is not within our realm. And I'll stop there because I really can't speak to it. Sorry.
Sorry to crowd Greg off the stage. I know the questions could go on for quite a while. I'd even had some more FIBERcast questions come in, and I'll forward those to you, Greg, so you can answer them. But in the knowing that we have a lot more to go on with the center launch today, we'll need to shut this down. And I'd like to thank Greg for joining us today and sharing his insights on collaboration for sustainable compliance. And I'd also like to thank the FIBERcast listeners for joining us. And thank you, and have a great day. And I'll see some of you on the remainder of the talks today.